Poor girl is ridiculed for using an old notebook. Even the millionaire picks up the same model and says, "This one saved me one day." And what he did next, no one saw coming. In the cold, spacious public school classroom, as everyone handed in their glossy-bound papers filled with colorful illustrations, Emily kept her eyes lowered as she held out, with trembling hands, an old notebook with a worn cover and yellowed pages. Laughter erupted immediately. "Did you find this in the trash?" "Lauren," the principal's daughter, scoffed. Other students guffawed, but the worst was yet to come. Sitting in the back of the room, silently observing everything, was Noah Clark, the young millionaire invited to give a lecture on success and the future. He approached slowly, stared at Emily's notebook for a moment and said aloud, "Do you really think this is worth a grade? How embarrassing." Emily, paralyzed, tried to hide her tears. The teacher hesitated, but said nothing. At that moment, Emily didn't. Know that the man who had just humiliated her carried a secret, and that old notebook, that exact model, had once saved his life. 3 weeks later, the same Noah Clark was seen at a multi-million-dollar charity event, surrounded by cameras, holding in his hands the exact notebook he had ridiculed. And before an astonished crowd, he declared, "This notebook saved my life. It was with one just like it that I wrote my first business plan, living in the basement of a library." The audience was moved. But what no one knew was that Noah had discovered something. Emily wasn't just a poor girl with an old notebook. She was the daughter of the woman who, years ago, had taken him in without asking for anything in return, when he was just a hungry and forgotten boy. And now, in front of the media, Noah had to do something he had never done before. Bow down. What he did next, no one saw coming. Before continuing, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and like this video so you can continue receiving our real stories. Thank you very much. In Brookhaven County, Georgia, amidst tree-lined streets and old mansions that exuded prestige, there was a public school that survived the stark contrast of inequality. Although the building was simple, with peeling paint and recycled furniture, it welcomed children from diverse families, from those from mansions to those arriving on foot, with holey shoes and patched backpacks. In this world where status seemed to walk the halls, Emily was practically invisible. She walked with her eyes fixed on the ground, her brown hair always tied back in a makeshift bun, wearing shabby clothes that never kept up with the latest trends. She didn't use a cell phone, didn't belong to any cliques, and didn't eat lunch with anyone. Yet there was something in her eyes that clashed with everything, a quiet flame of intelligence and resilience. That Monday morning, the students were restless. A special speaker was coming to school. Noah Clark, a young tech billionaire, a sort of local icon who loved to call himself formally poor, even though no one had ever confirmed his humble origins. The principal was filled with pride when announcing his visit, and the teachers asked the students to prepare an essay and submit it in printed form, as if it were a symbol of individual effort. Most students submitted laminated sheets, hardcovers, colorful graphs, and even QR codes pointing to videos. Emily, however, pulled out of her bag an old black-covered notebook with a crooked spiral binding and damp marks. The pages inside were filled with handwritten notes, written in small, organized letters. It was a journal of ideas, dreams, and observations she had cultivated for years, and which she used to write her essay on The Future I Imagine. The class was full when Noah entered. He wore a slim suit, a shiny wristwatch, and a practiced smile. The principal introduced him enthusiastically, and he began to walk among the students, picking up their papers to skim over. Then he stopped beside Emily. She held out her notebook with sweaty hands. He took it, looked at it, flipped through a few pages. Suddenly his expression changed. He closed the notebook slowly, looked up at the class and said, "Some people think effort is enough, but if you don't understand today's world, you're stuck in the past. This," and he held up Emily's notebook, "is a reflection of that." Laughter echoed. Emily froze. Noah placed his notebook on the table and walked back to the front of the room, saying, "If you want to make it in the world, you need to learn how to present yourself." The teacher, embarrassed, tried to change the subject, but the humiliation had already sunk in, and Emily once again was reminded of her place. However, that same night as Noah was tidying up his papers and collecting the work for review, he unknowingly took Emily's notebook with him, and when he opened it again at home, a sentence written in the corner of the back cover chilled his heart. To Mom, thank you for giving me the same roof where you took in that lost boy years ago. The memory was immediate. Noah, at 14, running away from home, sleeping next to the town library, shivering in the cold until a woman saw him, took him home, gave him hot soup, and offered him paper and a pen. The same notebook, the same gesture of dignity. Emily was that woman's daughter. But now, was it too late to undo what he'd done? Emily grew up amidst silence and waiting. She was the only child of a woman who worked as a cleaner in 3 different places, and even exhausted, never lacked dignity. She never knew her father. She only heard fragmented stories about a man who loved jazz, but lost himself to addictions before she could even walk. Her mother, Ellen, was the pillar of everything, not for her physical strength, but for her courage in maintaining faith in a world that seemed to always shut them out. They lived in a battered trailer on the outskirts of town, where hot water was a rare luxury, and the sound of branches tapping against the window at night served as a makeshift lullaby. Still, Emily grew up hearing her mother say, "You can have the whole world inside," pointing to her daughter's forehead, "if you never stop thinking." It was on one of those ordinary days, while waiting for her mother to finish a night shift cleaning a restaurant, that Emily saw a boy sleeping outside the community library. He was huddled, his head between his knees, wearing a coat that wasn't big enough for the cold. Emily was only 8 years old, but she never forgot what she felt, a mixture of curiosity and pity. She took what she had, a granola bar, and approached. The boy thanked her silently. When Ellen showed up, she didn't hesitate. She invited the boy to dinner, and for 3 nights, he stayed. He didn't ask anything. He just ate, bathed, and spent hours writing in a notebook Ellen gave him. Then he disappeared. He never came back. Emily always remembered it as a small forgotten miracle, something beautiful that had happened and that, for some reason, no one but them seemed to have noticed. This gesture left its mark. As she grew older, Emily began writing too. She kept everything in old, repurposed notebooks, her ideas, fears, dreams, loose sentences, and even book projects. It was a way of constructing on paper a world where she could exist without fear of rejection. The notebook she took to school that day was the most important of all. It was the one she'd been writing in since elementary school, and although she knew all the other students would hand in essays filled with graphs, laminated, and filled with frills, she honestly believed that the content was still what mattered most. But she wasn't naive. She had already learned the hard way that the world wasn't kind to those who seemed fragile. At school, Emily was called the rag girl by some, ghost by others. The principal's daughter, Lauren, was the leader of a small group that made a point of reminding Emily how much she didn't belong. Even the teachers, while not cruel, treated her with polite detachment. No one really saw her. Only her notebook was her confidant. And that's why that humiliation, in front of everyone, hurt her so deeply. It wasn't just a judgment on her work. It was a direct attack on the only part of her that still believed in the future. The notebook was, for her, an extension of her mother, her childhood, and that forgotten gesture of generosity toward an abandoned boy. The same boy who, years later, reappeared with an expensive suit and arrogance disguised as charisma. Emily didn't cry that day. She simply put her notebook back in her backpack, held her breath for a few seconds, and left the room without looking back. But deep down, a small certainty was beginning to form. She knew who he was, and he didn't yet know who she would become. The following week, the school hallways buzzed with a new rumor. Noah Clark, the millionaire, would return for another lecture, this time open to the public, attended by parents, local business owners, and community media. The principal was ecstatic. The school, which had lived in the shadow of the region's large private schools, was now in the spotlight. And to celebrate the moment, an idea challenge was announced. The 5 students with the best social impact projects would be invited to present their proposals directly to Noah on stage in front of everyone. The prize? A summer internship at his company, something that for any young person could change their life. Emily heard the news from a flyer pinned to the bulletin board. She hadn't considered participating. She still felt the bitter taste of shame. But that night, her mother found the notebook on her bed, open to the page where Emily was sketching out an idea for a digital platform to connect young writers with independent publishers. Ellen read it silently, stroked the page with her fingers and said, "Maybe it's time he remembers who helped build his empire." Emily then made her decision. She would apply. Meanwhile, across town, Noah was reviewing the papers he'd mistakenly taken. He found Emily's old notebook in a pile, and upon opening it, he immediately recognized the handwriting of the mother who had given him shelter so many years before. A note she'd written on the first page read, "Daughter, always remember, those who sow light, one day reap the sun." The impact was immediate. His mother's name, the style of her handwriting, the memory of the smell of hot soup, the mattress spread out on the trailer floor, it all came back like a punch to the chest. And then, the name Emily Thompson finally made sense. He leaned back in his chair in silence. For the first time in a long time, something inside him destabilized his cynical confidence. But the humiliation was already done. And to the world, Noah was still just the charismatic speaker, the cool millionaire. Only he knew how much that now bothered him. The day of the presentation arrived. The school gymnasium was packed. Cameras were rolling, banners with motivational phrases, and the principal was nervous about every detail. Emily entered last. She wore a simple blouse, her hair loose, and a notebook in her hands. Lauren, sitting in the front row, whispered to her friends, "Are you going to present with that notebook again?" What a joke. On stage, Noah positioned himself next to the microphone. When Emily's name was called, she slowly climbed the steps, taking a deep breath. She began speaking calmly, explaining her proposal while displaying handwritten pages, penned diagrams, and sentences highlighted in highlighter. The audience fell silent. Some were surprised, others were just waiting for the punchline. And then it happened. When Emily held out the notebook for Noah to look at, he hesitated for a second, carefully held it out, and stared at the back cover. A long silence fell over the gymnasium. Then he looked up at her and for the first time seemed truly human, but he said nothing. He simply handed the notebook back and announced, "Thank you. Next presentation." Emily stepped off the stage with a heavy heart, not because of his reaction, but because of Lauren's muffled laughter in the background, who whispered loudly enough. Not even the millionaire himself could praise this cardboard relic. And it was at that moment that the humiliation was complete. A crowded room, an old notebook, and a cowardly silence. Later that day, now without cameras or an audience, Noah walked the school hallways in silence, as if searching for something he couldn't even name. He found Emily alone in the library, leafing through old books with the same care one might leaf through the memory of someone who has died. She noticed his approach in the reflection in the window, but didn't turn around. He sat at a respectful distance, and after a long silence, murmured, "Did you write that alone?" Emily didn't answer immediately. She just closed the book slowly and, still without looking at it, said, "I wrote with everything I had. And that's not always enough, is it?" Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired, a kind of maturity that was disturbing. Noah tried to justify himself. "That day, I didn't know." But the sentence died before he could finish. He knew any excuse would seem small compared to what he'd done. Emily then slowly turned and looked straight into his eyes. There was pain there, but also something more dangerous, lucidity. "You didn't know," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. "Or did you know, and chose not to remember?" That question hung in the air like a silent poison. Noah swallowed hard. For the first time since fame had overtaken him, he had no ready answer. He was facing someone who wanted nothing from him. No favors, no money, no opportunities, just the truth. And that he had buried years ago. "You're her daughter, aren't you?" he murmured. "The woman who sheltered me." Emily just nodded. "That woman was my mother. You stayed there for 3 days. She didn't even know your name. But she gave you food, a blanket, and the only clean notebook we had in the house." She paused. "You used it to start your empire, and today you mocked the same object in front of a roomful." Noah lowered his eyes. He'd never felt so small. The silence between them was long, dense, filled with everything that couldn't be undone. He tried to move closer, but Emily stood. She tucked her notebook into her backpack as if closing a circle and said calmly, "You don't have to apologize, but you should at least remember who held your hand when the world turned its back on you." And he left the library without looking back. Noah remained there, sitting, staring at the empty chair. For the first time, the public image of the self-made man seemed to be shattered, and what remained deep down was just a scared boy who had once been saved, but forgotten. News of the presentation spread quickly, but not for the reasons Emily imagined. A short video recorded by one of the students leaked onto social media. It showed the exact moment she held out her notebook, and Noah hesitated, then looked away and thanked her curtly. The video went viral, not because of her, but because of the cold and indifferent way the millionaire had treated the girl, who was clearly offering something of value with her, heart in her mouth. The comments were divided between criticism and mockery, but the emotional weight fell on Emily once again. The next day, when she arrived at school, she found her locker spray-painted with the word notebook. It was the latest joke. A group of students staged a mock lesson in the courtyard, where one of them pretended to be Emily, offering failed ideas written in pen. Lauren, of course, was in charge of the performance. Amid laughter and videos, the humiliation went public and viral. During recess, Emily decided not to leave the classroom. She sat in silence, reading the same passage for the 3rd time, trying not to cry. The literature teacher came in and hesitated when she saw her. For a moment, he seemed to want to say something, but he just smiled and closed the door. That was the cruelest part, the silence of the adults who were supposed to protect her. But the climax came during a live interview Noah gave that afternoon to a local radio station. The host, trying to keep things light, asked about the lecture and the students' projects. Noah laughed and replied, "Some proposals were good, others a little dated. There were even elementary school notebooks. But that's part of it." The host's laughter drowned out what followed. The cut to that speech also went viral, and it hit Emily like a punch in the gut. That night, she didn't say anything to her mother. She simply left the plate untouched, went into her room, and spent hours staring at the ceiling, her notebook on her lap. The same notebook that had been her diary, her confidant, her shield. Now it was the source of her pain. But still, she didn't tear it up. She didn't burn it. She simply wrote, on a new blank page in a firm hand, "The tallest trees were once invisible seeds." Meanwhile, on the penthouse floor of a luxurious hotel, Noah watched the recorded interview. For the first time, he didn't recognize himself in his own tone of voice. The forced laugh, the automatic contempt, the unconscious sarcasm. It was like watching a version of himself he didn't remember creating. But the world continued to applaud. His followers grew. Invitations poured in. His name shone. And no one, absolutely no one, seemed to realize that behind that glow, an abyss was beginning to open. The following Friday, the school hosted a low-key event just for the seniors for the Idea Challenge. The conference room was decorated with makeshift posters and dimmed lights, trying to look welcoming. Emily arrived early, as always, notebook in hand. He sat in the back while the others huddled together, laughing and taking selfies. When Noah entered, he was greeted with subdued applause. He looked the same as always, impeccable, confident, untouchable. But his eyes sought someone and found her. She didn't look away. And there was something different about him too, something that for the first time seemed uneasy. Noah began speaking, making rehearsed jokes about overcoming obstacles, growth thinking and believing in yourself. But with each word, unease seemed to grow within him. And then something off-script happened. He stopped. He looked at Emily and said, "A lot of people think success is beating others. But really, success is not forgetting where you came from, and I forgot." The room fell silent. Some laughed, assuming it was part of the speech, but he continued. Someone here reminded me of that. Someone who handed me not just a project, but a memory, a truth I've tried to bury. He walked over to Emily's table. The tension was palpable. Everyone held their breath. He placed his hand on her notebook, the same one he'd ridiculed, and said, without looking at the others, "This notebook is more valuable than any Excel spreadsheet I've ever seen." Emily stared at him. There were tears in her eyes, but also control. Her breathing was steady. She didn't fight back. She didn't get worked up. Then she stood up. Everyone expected her to thank. Her, to cry, to forgive. But no. She simply took the notebook, held it close to her chest, and in a calm voice said, "You humiliated me, knowing exactly what that notebook meant. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." The room froze. She then looked at each face there, one by one, and added, "But don't worry, I won't erase who I am to fit into the kind of future you're trying to sell. I'd rather build my own." And with that, she turned and left. There was no shouting, no scandal, just the firm steps of someone who knew their own worth. Noah stood there, paralyzed. The timid applause that followed was almost an insult to the depth of that moment. But what Emily didn't see was what happened next. As the other students approached her in the hallway, silently, one by one, they began to apologize. Even Lauren, maybe out of shame, maybe out of respect, maybe out of fear of being on the wrong side of history. But Emily wasn't looking for an audience. She was looking for peace. And that day she conquered her, without needing to defeat anyone, just by being who she was. Noah didn't sleep that night. Lying in a 5-star hotel room overlooking Atlanta's illuminated skyscrapers, he stared at the ceiling as if waiting for some answer to fall from it. The image of Emily's face, firm and unwavering in the face of his belated attempt at recognition, repeated like an echo. He mentally revisited every detail of that library, the smell of dusty books, the sound of the rain outside, the steam of hot soup, the patched blanket, the silent warmth of a home that wasn't his. He remembered the woman who welcomed him, the generous gaze that never asked for anything in return. And then he remembered the name written on an old photo she had given him on the third night, Ellen Thompson. Overcome by a restlessness he couldn't name, Noah searched through his old emails, files, and forgotten documents. He wanted to be sure. He needed to know. And when he finally located an old note about a donation he'd made years before, he found the full name, Ellen Marie Thompson. It was her. There was no longer any doubt. The pain of shame began to seep through the cracks in his emotional armor. Emily was the daughter of the only person who had reached out to him when he was worthless, who treated him with dignity without expecting anything in return, who gave him his first notebook, and now he, the grown man, the example of overcoming, had spat on the very symbol of what had built him. He tried calling the school. The principal didn't answer. He emailed the event organizers, trying to locate Emily. No one knew, no one would say. It was then that he took a desperate step. He got in his car and drove to the neighborhood where he remembered living for those few days. After hours wandering through humble streets and crowded shacks, he stopped in front of a wooden house with a narrow porch. He recognized the rusty gate. He knocked on the door. No one answered. But when he looked out the window, he saw a portrait on the bookshelf. It was her, the same woman from years ago, a little older, but with the same calm smile. The final confirmation. Noah stepped back, sat on the porch steps, and cried. A dry, silent, ugly cry. The kind of cry that comes when you realize you can't undo what you've broken. The next day, he tried to find her again. He went to school. Emily was gone. She had stopped attending classes. The literature teacher, moved, simply said, "She needs time. And you." True repentance. Noah returned home empty. For the first time, fame weighed heavily. Money was embarrassing. Public admiration felt like mockery. Everything he had built now seemed built on the foundation of unforgivable oblivion. He felt like a traitor. And worse, he knew he was. Emily had disappeared. Not from social media. She'd never been there. But from the radar of those now trying to find her. After the incident with Noah, she stopped attending classes, didn't show up at community meetings, wasn't even seen on the buses she usually took. To some, she was just a rebellious teenager. To others, a typical case of giving up. But no one knew the truth. Emily had decided to disappear not out of weakness, but out of strength. She needed to rebuild herself away from the judgmental eyes, the fake smiles that came too late, and most importantly, away from the man who had forgotten her when it mattered most. She and her mother quietly moved to a small town 2 hours away. Ellen had found work as a cook at a nursing home, and Emily, at her mother's insistence, enrolled as a visiting student at a local technical school simply to maintain some connection with her studies. She always carried her notebook with her, but now she no longer wrote. She just reread, like someone who visits a sacred place but doesn't yet have the courage to rebuild it. Meanwhile, Noah became hostage to the silence she left behind. Emily's absence, previously ignored, now echoed everything he'd never properly heard. In interviews, he tried to appear normal, but something in his eyes betrayed the truth. People could tell something had shifted. The energy had changed. There was no longer that arrogant glow. There was a kind of mourning. He tried every possible way to find her. He called social workers, searched for school records, and even wrote an open letter published in a major newspaper. He didn't mention any names, but the content was clear. To the person who taught me the value of memory and gratitude, you owe me nothing, but I owe you everything. And the silence that has followed since then teaches me more than all the applause I've ever received. The letter went viral. Some readers were moved. Others criticized him, calling him a manipulator trying to clean up his image. But Emily, when she read it, yes, she read it, didn't cry. She simply closed the newspaper carefully, placed it inside her notebook, and wrote, for the first time in weeks, a single sentence. The emptiness he feels now is the exact space I left. Noah didn't know it. He just felt it. And in every silence, in every applause that now sounded hollow, in every million-dollar meeting where everything seemed automatic, he could only think, what if I had listened? What if I had remembered sooner? But time lost cannot be brought back. What began as a subtle criticism on social media turned into a storm. Noah's open letter, intended to sound like sincere repentance, backfired when journalists began investigating the girl behind the subtext. All it took was a connection to the school video, and Emily's name began circulating as a symbol of a youth overlooked by grand success stories. The story went viral, but this time it wasn't under his control. Influencers began openly criticizing Noah. The man who built his empire by forgetting who laid the first brick, they said. Podcasts aired episodes about the case. Education experts commented on the neglect of unconventional talents, and TV shows explored the contrast between appearance and reality. Some even called the episode "The Notebook That Dismantled a Millionaire." Outrage raged online. "You didn't just humiliate a girl, you mocked the symbol that saved you," wrote one cultural journalist. Another posted, "Emily didn't want fame, and that's precisely why she became unforgettable." Partner companies began to quietly withdraw. Noah's public image was becoming detached from his private reality. Guests cancelled appointments. Investor enthusiasm gave way to frosty meetings, suspicious looks and indirect questions. The company's shares didn't drop immediately, but consumer feedback made it clear. Trust isn't just about technology, it's about character. Noah was invited to a global conference in New York. The theme was the future of innovation, but his name, once a symbol of inspiration, began to be met with tension. At the press conference, a reporter asked the question he'd been dreading. "Do you believe your story of overcoming adversity was built at the expense of forgetting those who truly helped you?" He stopped. The camera focused on his eyes, and for the first time, he didn't respond. That same night, his marketing team suggested a damage control plan, but Noah refused. He hung up his phone, cancelled appointments, and retreated, not to hide, but because he knew no campaign would save what had been lost: his truth. Meanwhile, Emily remained distant from the media. She refused interviews. She didn't respond to invitations. It was as if the whole world was screaming her name and she chose silence. And, ironically, the quieter she remained, the more powerful her presence became. Noah now felt firsthand what she had experienced for years, the weight of being ignored, the superficial judgment, the loneliness in the crowd. But for him, it all came with an added layer: guilt. The justice the world demanded of him was symbolic, but real. And each of Emily's silences echoed like a trial. Without a judge, without a sentence, but definitive. Noah spent weeks in seclusion. His luxurious apartment high above Manhattan, once a symbol of victory, now felt like a glass prison. The panoramic windows showed the world outside, but he no longer felt part of it. His reflection in the mirrors bothered him. He no longer saw the charismatic man who had won over audiences with his one-liners. He saw a lost boy, dressed in success, who had betrayed his own origins. He began declining invitations, avoiding in-person meetings, and delegating important decisions to his directors. The board noticed the change. Some members suggested he step down as chairman for image reasons. He accepted without resistance. For the first time, Noah Clarke was willing to disappear, not as punishment, but as purification. In his solitude, he revisited the basement of the library where he had slept as a child. He found, with permission, old records and scribbles still at the bottom of the drawers. As he leafed through an old notebook, not his own but that of another forgotten boy, he felt a lump in his throat. All those anonymous young people with untold stories, forgotten, like Emily almost was. On the way out, an older librarian recognized him. He approached and said softly, "She came here a few weeks ago. She left an envelope." Noah froze. The man handed him the small, plain package with no return address. Opening it, he found a single handwritten sheet. It was her handwriting. The phrase was short, but it stung like a sentence. "You needed to fall to remember you were once on the ground." That was it. No signature, no explanation. But it was more than any speech he'd ever heard. Over the next few days, Noah began attending local public schools, not as a lecturer but as a listener. He would quietly enter classrooms, sit in the back, and listen to students talk about their dreams. No one took selfies. No one recognized him, and he liked it that way. The transformation wasn't quick, but it was real. He sold some of his shares, invested in scholarships for students who wrote with pen and paper. He reopened community centers that had been closed due to lack of funding, and he created an anonymous program called Project Notebook, where young people could submit their idea journals and receive support without having to show their faces. None of the materials were published. It was just listening, silence, caution. Noah knew that none of this would change the past, that no amount of action would restore what had been broken. But maybe, just maybe, he could prevent other talents from being stifled by the contempt of someone like him. And in the back of his office, now devoid of canvases, trophies, and mirrors, the only object on the desk was an old black notebook, the original with tape marks and torn edges. With each page, he remembered, and had learned finally not to forget. It was on a warm, late afternoon, with the sky tinged orange, and the birds returning to the branches, that Noah saw her again. He was at a small used book fair in a square in rural Georgia. He wasn't sure why he'd come here. Perhaps it was fate, perhaps just the weight of silence begging for redemption. Emily's back was turned, her hair loose, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. A child sat beside her, listening intently as she read from a book. The setting was so simple it bordered on the sacred. She had found her place, a place where she could teach, without interruption, where her voice was heard effortlessly, where the old notebook was no longer a joke but a living inheritance. Noah stood at a distance. He watched silently. He didn't want to intrude, didn't want to announce himself, but the child pointed at him. Emily turned slowly. Their eyes met. There was no surprise. She had already known this moment would come. There was absolute serenity in the way she stood and walked toward him, unhurried, as if the pain of the past had become a calm river that no longer needed to flow. "You found me," she said, without emotion, just realization. "I haven't stopped looking," he replied, his voice trembling with the truth. Emily looked him up and down. She no longer saw the man from the headlines, nor the lost boy. She saw only someone desperately trying to reconnect with the part of himself he'd left behind. "I didn't come to apologize," Noah said, "because I know that would be asking too much. But I needed to say that now I remember. Everything. The soup, the blanket, the gesture, the notebook, and you." She lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked back up. "It took a while," was all she said. But it wasn't with anger, it was with truth, and that, more than any absolution, completely disarmed him. "Do you still write?" he asked, as if that defined whether the world was still salvageable. Emily pulled a new notebook from her bag, not the old one, a new one, with a plain cover, no drawings. She handed it to him. "Read it." "Now," she said, "it's about a man who forgot where he came from, but remembered in time to change the ending of the story." Noah opened it. The first page was blank except for a single sentence written at the top. "Memory is what keeps us from betraying who we were." They stood there for moments that seemed eternal. There was no hug, no tears, just a silent peace between two destinies that finally recognized each other. Time seemed suspended there, between the new notebook and the past that still pulsed in his eyes. Noah held the object so carefully, as if he feared that at the slightest movement it would disappear again. Emily, for her part, stood erect, as if no longer swayed by emotion. She didn't want revenge. She wanted the truth. And now, finally, she had it before her. "Why did you come here?" she asked, looking at him as if she were going through layers. "Because I can't move on without hearing from you. Not again." His answer came out almost in a whisper, as if each word were too heavy. Emily took a deep breath. She stared at the horizon as if asking the heavens for confirmation only the heart could understand. And then she said, with painful firmness, "You want redemption, but you won't find it with me." He nodded slowly. For the first time he understood without trying to convince. "I know," he replied. "I just wanted you to know that I haven't forgotten." She watched him silently. Then she walked to the book table, picked up the old black notebook, the same, one worn, now with its edges patched with cloth, and returned to it. She held it out to him with both hands and said, "Take it. You left it here when you turned your back on the one who saved you. Now, take it back, not as a debt, but as a reminder." He took it, excited, his eyes full but not spilling. Emily continued, "And don't look for me anymore. What I had to teach you, you've already learned. The rest is up to you." Noah hesitated, his lips parted as if to beg for another chance, but he decided against it. He understood. True redemption doesn't beg. It's silent, and it transforms. She smiled for the first time. A small smile, but a full one. She turned, walked back to the circle of children, and, as if nothing had happened, began reading again. Noah remained motionless for a few more seconds, the notebook clutched to his chest. Then he turned and left. This time, without promises, without catchphrases. Just a notebook in his hands, and a void filled with something he could never forget. Months later, at a public school in a small town, a teacher distributes simple notebooks to new elementary school students. The covers are black, unadorned, but sturdy. When one of the children asks why they're all the same, she responds with a smile. "Because the stories you're going to write here don't exist yet, and they all deserve to start from the same place." On each back cover, there is a sentence printed in cursive. "Memory is what keeps us from betraying who we were." The camera pulls back. We see the children opening their notebooks, scribbling down their first dreams, laughing loudly, unaware that they hold an invisible legacy in their hands. On one wall of the room, discreetly, hangs an unframed painting. Inside is the original notebook, old, with worn pages, ink stains, and a handwritten inscription, nearly erased by time. "To Mom. Thank you for giving me the same roof where you took in that lost boy." The late afternoon light shines through the window and touches the painting like a whisper. Outside among the courtyard trees, a man watches from a distance, Longer hair, simple clothes, and a serene expression. He doesn't enter. He simply nods, as if understanding the value of no longer being at the center of the story. And as he walks away in silence, a child, not knowing who he is, waves from the window. He smiles, and he disappears into the dirt street, carrying nothing but an old notebook against his chest. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to your heart. Now tell me in the comments, what part touched you the most? I read everything and respond with love. Don't forget to like it. It really helps spread stories like this to more people. And if you're not subscribed yet, click the red button and join our community. Oh, and don't leave yet. The video that's appearing on your screen now will give you even more chills. Click it and continue this journey with us.